We're going to talk about Stencil today and how web components in general are going to solve all of our problems. I'm Mike Hartington. If you guys need to reach out, ask any questions, M. Hartington basically anywhere. First initial, last name. Simple, super easy. So we'll get started with it and just kind of look at where we came from real quickly, because I think that's really going to show how we've evolved as a ecosystem, and how ideas that were popularized back early in JavaScript, in JavaScript's history, are now actually coming to fruition today. So roughly 2013, Ionic itself was really just an idea that we were playing around with after being frustrated with a lot of tools that already existed. For instance, popular library, jQuery. That was still king. jQuery was still big. It was kind of slow. It was kind of big. And frameworks at the time didn't really exist in ways that we know them today. So, for instance, Backbone. Who remembers writing Backbone apps? Who remembers liking writing Backbone apps? Exactly. It's all right. There's always one. So yeah, frameworks weren't really that great compared to what we have now. And from us at Ionic, our perspective was we just wanted to remove all the needs for a framework, or remove the idea that a framework actually existed. It's something that we've held true even to this day, is making an app or making some kind of UI or using a framework or a library should be as simple as just including some tags or having all of it encapsulated for you. Again, we already touched on it. JavaScript at the time, jQuery, wasn't really a framework, but it did do something pretty awesome, which I don't think people give it much credit for, and that was the concept of jQuery plugins. Name any site out there, it's using jQuery UI. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's using jQuery UI. It's using some kind of custom jQuery plugin, and that kind of got us into the right place. We had this idea of, here is a collection of DOM interactions that are extracted out into a single JavaScript library. You include jQuery, you include the library, you give it a DOM node, it takes care of the rest. Backbone kind of had some ideas like this, specifically with Marionette, but it only cared really about a lot of some of the data layer. And then we saw Angular, which was still pretty new at the time, take all these ideas and push it a million years ahead. For instance, we just heard about them, AngularJS Directives. This really, to me, was a big shift in how we thought about development. You didn't have to actually know what a piece of code you were using was doing under the hood. You just knew, here's my tag, here are these properties. It takes care of the rest. And that's something I think is pretty powerful. Now, fast forward to what we have today. Angular 2, 4, and 5. We have Preact and React. We're going to group them together. They're similar enough. Somewhere out there, someone who really likes Preact will yell at me for that. Ember is up there. Vue.js is the newcomer. All these frameworks really focus around the idea of components. Your app is really just a series of components from the ground up. They are a series of UI widgets, whether they be just some kind of higher order component, or a list item, or an icon. Yeah, anytime you want to change frameworks, or anytime you have like 3 or 4 different teams that don't use the same framework, if you have like your own internal UI library, or you have to find a new UI library, you have to relearn that coding, that API for that framework, and that's really frustrating, especially for a company like Ionic, where we make UI widgets. Having to relearn, say, Angular from AngularJS, and then possibly looking into, do we want to support Vue? We don't want to learn a whole new framework every time a different one comes out. And this is kind of where web components come in and solve all of these issues. Has anyone ever heard of web components before? Say a few of you. Of those people, how many of you have actually used a web component or written one? Okay, a little less. How many of you have heard of Polymer? Okay, so all the same hands, but same idea. Polymer is just a flavor of a web component, and we'll get into that later. So web components, what are they? Vanilla API in pure JavaScript built into the browser that creates the idea of custom elements. So everything that you would think of an AngularJS directive in an element form, an Angular component now, but just baked right into the browser, and the browser knows how to handle it. The important part is that it is a standard. So instead of having to relearn a new implementation every time you want to go to a different framework, you can just fall back onto what the standards say it should behave like and just go from there. And it's baked into all the standard evergreen browsers. So Chrome has support for it. Safari, yay for Safari. They have support for web components. Edge has support in its nightly previews, and same thing for Firefox. So web components to get in here, it's taken a little bit longer than most people would like, but good news is that you can polyfill most of this stuff all the way back to IE 11. I think you can do some stuff in IE 10, but when you want to start messing with like Shadow DOM, IE 10 is better left dead. If you can't see that, it's the funny XKCD. There are 14 competing standards. They're all stupid. Let's make a new one. 15 competing standards. Web components does not fit into this because it already is a standard, at least I think. It tries to solve all the problems that most framework view layers try to attempt to solve, but does it in the browser itself. So for those who have never used a web component or never written one, this is a quick example of a element called Better Image. It's by my friend Pearl. You can find it up github.com perlbay/betterimage. And essentially, we have a class. It extends the base HTML element. Yes, there is a base HTML element. We have a constructor. We have some default parameters where these are really just getters. And then we have this really cool thing called connected callback. Connected callback, ng on init. It's the same thing by a different name. And essentially, this is our lifecycle hook where we're saying, OK, the component has been instantiated. Let's do something. In this case, we're just setting some inner HTML, adding an error listener, and setting a source to an image. So the rest of this, really all it does is create a better image tag where you can provide an image, a fallback URL, and then some width and height, similar to the default image tag. Yeah, we're really just setting inner HTML to a template string. It's the best. And then the important part is when we want to tell the browser about this, we have this custom elements.define, where we give it our tag name, and then either a class reference, or in some cases, you can even use a function if you don't want to have a class and you want to stay ES5 only. Some people like that. But I think having a class is nicer. Now, they're really powerful. You get all these things. You get lifecycle hooks. You get hooks for when possible properties or when something has changed, where you can start diffing some of these changes. You have inner HTML for some kind of templating system. There are proposals to make it better, but you have the building blocks, these really low-level building blocks, and that's kind of a problem. It's a bit too low-level for me. You have to know how to manage all these decisions when, okay, this changed and that changed. How do we reconcile those differences and update the HTML? You essentially create your own rendering system, which, why? And then on top of that, you essentially are just setting inner HTML. What about something like virtual DOM? I hear that's what all the cool kids are using. JSX, React uses it. It must be perfect. Asynchronous rendering, that's actually really cool. Or server-side rendering, or even pre-compilation. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. It's still pretty new. All these cool things that we get from other frameworks like Angular, React, Preact, Vue. Web components just don't have that. That's where we built Stencil because we missed all those features and we wanted to add them back. So what is Stencil itself? Stencil itself is not a framework at all. But what we call it is a build time API. Essentially, when you code a Stencil component, you have all these helper APIs that exist at author time, and then when you run it through a build, you generate a vanilla web component with vanilla event listeners and a small runtime that actually manages the component itself. But when you go into the dev tools, there is no stencil.config, there is no stencil object at runtime. So we say it's a build time API. And like I said, it outputs a vanilla web component, so we're not creating our own standard. We are not using our own implementations of different APIs. It's just a vanilla web component and vanilla JavaScript. And we're going to take a look at a base component, but it borrows a lot of concepts that you may like from different frameworks. And again, really want to push this point. It's not a framework itself, despite what you are about to see. Totally not a framework. So demo time. Yeah, I use Vim. Get over it. I had to say that. So we have this really quick little dev server going on. We'll bump that up. Hello world, I'm Stencil, don't call me a framework JS. And we have our directory where essentially we just have this source folder. I wonder what's in there. Components, wonder what's in there. My component, where we have a style SAS file, a unit test, and then a TypeScript file. Now, TSX, this is TypeScript, but with React. So really all that means is it supports JSX. So I'll give you a second to just kind of digest this and see what you think. So the Angular part, pretty clear to see where we took inspiration from. This component decorator essentially just says, hey, the class that comes after it, treat this as a component. Right? That's similar to what we see in Angular today. One difference, we chose to use tag instead of selector because web components can only exist as a tag name. They can't exist as a class reference or a property or attribute. So we figured that was worth a change. The next thing is just style URL. We're just passing a reference to an external file, and you could use Sass or CSS, and the compiler would just know how to handle it. So it's pretty simple, you know, nothing too crazy going on there. And the last part is just these two props, and then this render function, which we'll look at. So props, you guys already know these. And just to prove it, the Angular version of this would just be an input. And why do we use prop instead of input? It's pretty simple. What is an input actually? An element property. We're exposing something onto our HTML that we want the user to pass data into. I get where the Angular team thought that input kind of made sense, but for us, let's just call it what it is, a property. And we just had some TypeScript type definitions, which we don't really need to worry about. And then we have our render function. Now, this is the only part that really seems familiar to JSX or to React, and that's because it just uses JSX, which essentially is our JavaScript representation of what we want for the DOM. So we have div, and then we can set our bindings using this.firstname and this.lastname. Pretty simple. But because this is just JavaScript, we get all of the completion for all of the built-in DOM methods. So no additional language service. Because it's all in JavaScript, we get to take advantage of all that, which is pretty nice. Now, what does this actually look like when you want to use it? We have my component, first equals stencil, and then last, don't call me a framework JS. Pretty straightforward, pretty approachable, and this component gets isolated to itself. It knows how to bootstrap itself because it's just using web standards. There's no additional runtime needed. But one better is we can be fancy now. Why don't we select the component itself, and we'll just say $0 first equals, I don't think you guys saw that real quick. So $0, we have our element. Oh, first. Built-in completion in the DevTools, which I think is a pretty nice feature. We'll just say, my name is Michael, and it automatically updates. Will be trickier even more. Say last equals, I may butcher your last name, Mike. I'm so sorry. Boom. We just have it all working. Is that actually spelled right? Yeah. I was hoping I remember it. So we have this all working. It's all using browser standard browser methods, but we can take it a step further. So if you try to do what I'm about to do with a regular Angular component, it may not work. So let's just say for C equals document create element. Boom. So now we have this working. We have the component. We get all the benefits of having a framework like APIs available, but we're just creating web components. So maybe that doesn't look that impressive. But let's run. I think start. Let's run an actual Angular app using Stencil, actually using a pre-release version of Ionic built with Stencil and built with web components. What do we know? We have a Angular app using all web components, and you can never tell. And that's kind of one of the nice things about Angular is that to add web component support, we just had to say, use the custom element schema, which so much easier than, say, Vue, where you have to explicitly whitelist certain elements. But this all works. This all has navigation inside of it. We're hoping to get this out soon. This is quite impressive to me. May not be to you, but I think it's pretty cool. So we'll put those demos up on GitHub and so a way you guys can check them out. But really, the API for the last part of it is just these few decorators. We really are sold on the idea that decorators are the way to go when developing a framework or a build tool. See, it even trips me up. We have component, prop, state for when you want to cause a re-render but not expose it to the user, events for creating custom events, listen for listening to events, whether they be built-ins or customs, and then element for getting a direct reference to the component. And this is something I've been trying to think of a good response to. Angular Elements has been getting a lot of traction, and it's pretty impressive to see where they're going with it. And I think they're complementary projects. Similar ideas. We want to be able to reuse a component wherever we go, whether we have a framework or not, but different goals. So I want to see where Angular Elements can go. Who knows, maybe a Stencil component inside of an Angular element wrapped inside wrapped as web component. Maybe we can get some JavaScript inception going on. And this isn't the only tool. I can't forget these two. Skate.js is pretty awesome. If you guys have not looked at it before, I'm quite a fan of it. And it's got a very dedicated developer who works on it full-time. Well, not full-time, but he works on it as well as working at a full-time job. So definitely check it out, see what he thinks. And then Lit Element is a new one from a friend, Kenneth, who took Lit HTML and just made a base element out of it. I think it's got a lot of progress. But yeah, different options for whatever fits your needs. So if you're curious to see what we got going on, check out StencilJS.com. You can see all the documentations that we have up on there. We have this really nice asynchronous rendering demo where it may not look great inside of the projector, but on the screen it looks really smooth. Take my word for it. And then where we're going with it, Ionic, is we're building our next version of the framework with Stencil. So it'll be Ionic Core 4.0 built with Stencil, coming out soon. And if you guys do check it out and you want to, and you build something and you think it's pretty cool and you want to let us know, please tweet at us. We want to know. We want to help promote it. Also, I want to see this badge take off because it took me forever to figure out how to get an SVG inside of a badge with basic C4. So I want to see that in all the READMEs. But yeah, StencilJS.com. Take a look at it, and thank you.